It was just before dawn, somewhere in Texas, early 1944. The horizon was a thin gray line, the air cool and still. Inside the barbed wire perimeter, hundreds of German prisoners stirred in their bunks as a distant bugle echoed across the camp. Boots scraped on the wooden floors. A guard's whistle cut through the quiet. The smell came first. Coffee, strong, bitter, unmistakable. Then the faint sizzle of bacon. The warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread baking in the mess hall ovens. The prisoners hesitated, blinking in disbelief. Some thought it was a trick, a sensory illusion born from hunger and homesickness. But when they stepped outside, it was real. American cooks, sleeves rolled up, were serving steaming trays of food. Tin mugs filled with coffee. Loaves sliced in thick pieces. Bacon, hot, crisp, and plentiful. A few of the German soldiers stood motionless, eyes fixed on the meal laid before them. One finally whispered, "Das ist unmöglich." It felt impossible. Behind the wire, the rising sun lit the American flag fluttering above the camp gate. For the first time, many of these men realized they were captives in a nation that fought differently, not only with force, but with conscience. By 1944, the United States had become the unlikeliest home for thousands of German prisoners of war. It began quietly, with ships crossing the Atlantic under heavy escort, vessels that carried not troops, but the captured soldiers of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. They came from the deserts of North Africa, from the hedgerows of France, from Italian battlefields where surrender had replaced strategy. When they arrived at American ports, the war they had waged under Hitler's banners met a reality that confounded everything they'd been told. From 1942 to 1946, more than 400,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and a smaller number of Japanese, were held in the United States. They were scattered across over 600 camps from California to the Carolinas, built in open farmland, forest clearings, and abandoned fairgrounds. Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Atterbury in Indiana, and Camp Shelby in Mississippi became temporary worlds, fenced-in towns where the defeated lived among the victorious. For many Americans, the sight of enemy soldiers on U.S. soil was shocking. Posters had warned for years that Germans were ruthless invaders capable of anything. Now they stood quietly in line at chow halls or worked under guard in fields. Their uniforms faded, their faces young and tired. But beneath that uneasy peace lay a carefully constructed policy, one that reflected not just military necessity, but a national philosophy. The U.S. government, guided by the War Department and the Articles of the 1929 Geneva Convention, insisted on strict adherence to humane treatment. Every German POW was entitled to adequate food, shelter, medical care, and recreation, the same conditions given to American troops. It wasn't generosity. It was discipline. The U.S. Army wanted to set a standard, a living proof that democracy and decency could function even in the midst of total war. The reasoning was both moral and strategic. President Roosevelt's administration understood that the treatment of prisoners could directly influence how American captives were treated overseas. News traveled fast even in wartime, and the Red Cross served as the link between opposing sides. If Germany learned that its captured soldiers were being cared for under humane conditions, there was hope that downed American airmen or captured GIs might receive similar treatment, however faint that hope might be. But there was another dimension: psychological warfare. The War Department's Civil Affairs Division recognized that the conduct of American guards, officers, and even cooks could become a weapon more powerful than propaganda leaflets. If captured Germans experienced a life that contrasted sharply with what they'd been taught about decadent democracies, they might begin to question the very system they had fought to defend. In this, the United States built something extraordinary, not a fortress of punishment, but a system of persuasion. When the first major influx of German POWs arrived in 1943, many were stunned before they even left the transport ships. Expecting hostility or execution, they were met instead with efficiency. Military police searched them, cataloged their possessions, and issued clean uniforms marked with PW. Medical checks followed, along with showers and vaccinations. They were assigned barracks, given bedding, and handed meal tickets. The camps themselves resembled small military towns, wooden huts lined in rows, a canteen, a chapel, even a theater and larger installations. Guards were firm but rarely brutal. Daily routines followed a rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, assigned work, recreation, lights out. To men accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, it felt both familiar and disorienting. Then came the food. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, prisoners were to receive rations equal to those of American soldiers, approximately 3,000 calories per day. It was a standard Germany itself no longer met by 1944. As the war drained Europe of supplies, German civilians and soldiers alike faced shortages. Yet in the heart of Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia, their captured sons were eating eggs, bacon, and bread at dawn, and stew or roast beef by evening. Reports from the International Red Cross confirmed the phenomenon. The prisoners appear well-fed and healthy, one Swiss delegate wrote after inspecting Camp Polk in Louisiana. Another noted that POWs received rations superior to those available to much of Europe. It was not uncommon for German officers to protest the abundance, fearing that it violated the dignity of wartime austerity. One lieutenant famously refused dessert, claiming it was not fitting for prisoners, but others adapted quickly. Within weeks, American food became one of the most talked about topics in POW letters home, letters censored but permitted under Geneva Convention rules. Families in Germany could scarcely believe them. "We get bacon, butter, and coffee," one prisoner wrote in late 1944. "They even give us cigarettes. It is a different world." For American guards and civilians, this treatment sometimes provoked resentment. With rationing in effect across the United States, it was not uncommon for families of servicemen to see enemy soldiers eating better than they did. Newspapers printed occasional complaints. Why should we feed them steak while our boys eat rations overseas? Yet the War Department stood firm. "We will not descend to the level of our enemies," one official memo stated. The United States fights its wars by its own rules. Those rules were not always easy to maintain. Isolated incidents of mistreatment occurred, and discipline within camps varied depending on the commanding officer. But overall, the consistency of the American system impressed even neutral observers. Red Cross officials who toured both Allied and Axis camps noted that the U.S. stood nearly alone in its adherence to Geneva standards. Behind the wire, a peculiar coexistence emerged. German POWs worked in agriculture, manufacturing, and logging, helping alleviate America's wartime labor shortages. Farmers in Texas, Kansas, and Minnesota often praised their efficiency. They were paid in canteen coupons rather than cash, redeemable for toiletries, magazines, or extra rations. The work gave them purpose and, unintentionally, glimpses into ordinary American life. When they were transported off base under guard, many encountered civilians who treated them with curiosity rather than hatred. Children waved, shopkeepers stared, and some farmers even shared coffee with them during breaks. The propaganda image of America as a land of corruption and decay began to dissolve. These encounters carried more psychological weight than any leaflet or broadcast. By 1944, the War Department had turned POW management into a precise science. Each camp operated like a self-contained town, run partly by the prisoners themselves under American oversight. Committees organized cultural events, athletic games, and even educational courses. Many Germans enrolled in re-education programs, where lectures on democracy, literature, and post-war reconstruction replaced ideological dogma. Others played instruments in orchestras or performed Shakespeare in makeshift theaters. To the outside observer, it looked almost surreal, the enemies of democracy being educated in democracy while the war still raged. But to American planners, it was deliberate. The camp system was a laboratory for post-war Germany, built not on revenge but on reorientation. Of course, not every prisoner welcomed it. Hardline Nazis among the inmates saw the humane treatment as a trap, a moral weakness to exploit. Some tried to maintain strict discipline among their comrades, enforcing ideological purity through intimidation. There were even a few assassinations within the camps, carried out by fanatics against those they called traitors. Yet the American command adapted, separating radicals from moderates, reinforcing internal order with firm but fair leadership. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the contrast between captivity and the collapsing Reich grew starker. News of Allied advances, bombed German cities, and the devastation of the Eastern Front reached the camps through censored newspapers and rumors. For many POWs, the first real doubt took root not in defeat on the battlefield, but in the breakfast lines of America. The same men who had marched under banners of conquest were now learning, through experience rather than ideology, what life under restraint could mean when ruled by law instead of fear. The sound of a bugle, the smell of fresh bread, the sight of fair treatment, these became small but powerful lessons. In the calm routines of the American POW camps, a subtle transformation began. Some prisoners still clung to pride. Others began to rethink everything they had believed about war, enemies, and the world beyond their borders. And as dawn came again, with coffee, bacon, and bread on the tables, the question spread quietly among them. What kind of nation treats its captives this way while the bombs still fall? That question, more than any rifle or tank, would prove the most disarming weapon of all. Life. Inside an American prisoner of war camp was a world built on paradox, a place where the defeated lived with more dignity than they'd known under their own regime, and where morality itself became a subtle instrument of warfare. To the Germans behind the wire, daily existence felt both strange and disarming. Everything was ordered, structured, and efficient, but never cruel. Each morning began the same way. A roll call in the crisp air, the clatter of metal cups and the smell of coffee brewing from enormous kitchen vats. German non-commissioned officers organized their men, calling out names, reporting attendance. The American guards watched quietly, rifles slung over their shoulders, speaking only when needed. Many of the guards were young, some barely 20, yet they carried themselves with a professionalism that surprised their captives. To German soldiers raised on propaganda that portrayed Americans as chaotic, lazy, or morally weak, the discipline they saw contradicted everything they'd been told. The camp gates, adorned with simple PW signs, led not into a place of revenge but into something closer to an experiment in controlled humanity. Breakfast was the first shock. It was hearty, consistent, and plentiful. Scrambled eggs, bread baked fresh that morning, oatmeal with sugar, sometimes even bacon or sausage when supplies allowed. The POWs were permitted coffee every day. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes they'd grown used to in wartime Germany. At first, many refused to believe it would last. But it did. For the Americans, the reasoning was clear. Adherence to the Geneva Convention meant showing moral strength, not indulgence. It also meant something deeper, psychological pressure through generosity. To feed a man well while his own nation starved was to force him to confront the difference between systems, between values, between what war had taught and what reality now revealed. By 1944, this quiet psychological campaign had taken hold across the U.S. Army's POW administration. The War Department's Prisoner of War Division, under the Provost Marshal General's office, issued specific guidelines: fair treatment, equal rations, structured routines, and opportunities for self-governance. You are dealing with human beings, one directive stated. Treat them as such, and you will achieve more than with any weapon. The results were tangible. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, POWs built furniture, cultivated crops, and even published their own German-language newsletters. In Camp Swift, Texas, where mornings began with the now famous breakfasts, prisoners worked in local cotton fields under light guard, often singing German folk songs as they labored. Farmers who hired them marveled at their discipline and politeness. The cooperation wasn't born from loyalty. It was born from mutual understanding. The Germans worked because they were treated as men, not as animals. They learned quickly that effort brought small freedoms: extended recreation time, access to the canteen, or permission to write longer letters home. Those letters became silent ambassadors of American conduct. Censored for military secrets but otherwise allowed, they reached German families who read with disbelief about the decency shown to their sons. "We eat meat every day," one POW wrote from Louisiana. "We play soccer on Sundays and are given books to read. The guards treat us like soldiers, not criminals." Back in Germany, such letters undermined Joseph Goebbels' propaganda that painted Americans as barbaric. It was an unintentional form of ideological warfare, one that spoke not in slogans but in lived experiences. For some prisoners, the shock was emotional. In interviews decades later, former German soldiers recalled the morning routine as the first time they truly questioned what they had fought for. The Americans gave us coffee, one remembered, while at home. My mother queued for hours for a piece of bread. Another said, I realized that the world we were told to hate was more civilized than the one we had served. Camp psychologists and American officers understood this transformation as a process of quiet re-education. Without lectures, without coercion, the very orderliness and fairness of camp life became its own moral lesson. Cultural life flourished within the wire. Many POWs organized orchestras, wrote plays, or formed study groups. The U.S. Army even encouraged intellectual rehabilitation, sending reading materials that ranged from Goethe to American civics. Some camps hosted lectures on democracy and post-war reconstruction, taught by German-speaking American officers or European refugees who had fled the Reich. One of the most remarkable examples occurred at Camp Atterbury, where the University of Democracy was founded, a program that offered classes in philosophy, history, and government. Attendance was voluntary, yet the classes filled quickly. For some German soldiers, it was the first time they had encountered ideas forbidden under Nazism: free thought, individual rights, and responsibility beyond obedience. Meanwhile, daily work became a form of cultural exchange. The POWs were assigned to help in local industries, particularly agriculture. America's labor shortage had grown severe by 1944, as millions of young men served overseas. German labor quietly filled the gap. Across the Midwest, you could find scenes that felt almost surreal. Enemy soldiers picking apples alongside American farmers, or repairing barns under the watchful eyes of local sheriffs. At first, civilians were wary. Mothers warned children not to approach the Krauts, but curiosity soon softened suspicion. Many farmers realized these young men, some barely 20, others veterans of North Africa or Normandy, were not monsters. They were simply soldiers who had obeyed orders, fought, and lost. In the evenings, some farmers brought them coffee or fruit as gestures of goodwill. There were no handshakes, no words exchanged across the language barrier, just small human acts. The War Department discouraged fraternization, but in rural America, humanity often ignored the rules. That quiet connection had long-term consequences. When those same POWs were sent home after the war, many carried stories of decency that spread through post-war Germany like a whispered legend. Inside the camps, morale varied. Some men clung to Nazi ideology, forming secret groups that tried to enforce loyalty among their peers. These hardliners painted swastikas on barracks walls and threatened those who spoke positively about the Americans. The U.S. command responded with careful segregation, relocating fanatics to isolated compounds, allowing moderates and apolitical soldiers to live in relative peace. The contrast between the two groups deepened the psychological divide. The extremists saw kindness as weakness. The moderates began to see it as strength. This division quietly dismantled the ideological unity of the German army, one breakfast and one conversation at a time. There were also the Red Cross inspections, which reinforced America's credibility. Delegates visiting the camps often documented the routines with precision: rations, sanitation, recreation. One report from Camp Shanks noted that POWs had access to newspapers, radios, monitored but not censored for morale, and organized sports. They appear content, disciplined, and well-fed, it read. For a world at war, such words carried significance beyond statistics. They were moral ammunition. At Christmas 1944, while Europe burned in the Battle of the Bulge, the American camps held holiday meals for prisoners. Chaplains organized Christian services, guards decorated simple trees, and the kitchens prepared special dinners: turkey, potatoes, gravy, and even pie. The symbolism wasn't lost on the men. They were enemies, yet still treated as human souls on a holy day. Many later described that Christmas as the moment they understood what moral victory looked like. Yet not everything was idyllic. Captivity carried its own burdens: homesickness, guilt, uncertainty about families in bombed-out towns. Some POWs fell into silence, others into defiance. But the routine itself, the coffee, the bread, the structure, kept despair at bay. The Red Cross also noted a remarkable physical recovery among many prisoners. Malnourished men from the Italian front regained weight within weeks of arrival. Skin infections, trench foot, and anemia disappeared. American food and medical care reversed months of deprivation. Some German doctors within the camps even admitted that U.S. military medicine was the most advanced in the world. The German officers, especially those from the Afrika Korps, faced a deeper humiliation but also a strange respect. The legendary units of Rommel's army, once symbols of German pride, were now confined behind barbed wire yet treated with a fairness their own leadership had often denied. One Afrika Korps officer wrote later, "We lost to a nation that fought with reason. That is a loss one can accept." That sentiment echoed across hundreds of camps by war's end. What began as obedience to international law had become something more profound, a demonstration of America's ideological power. By 1945, the system was running so efficiently that POWs were even trusted to manage internal affairs. They elected camp leaders, maintained order, and resolved disputes under U.S. supervision. The result was an unspoken respect between captors and captives, a relationship built on rules rather than rage. To the outside observer, it looked ordinary. But to the men who lived it, every breakfast was an act of revelation. Each sip of coffee was proof that the world beyond war could be civilized. In the years that followed, historians would call it one of the most successful prisoner management operations in history, not because of its security, but because of its psychology. The humane treatment of German POWs turned thousands of former enemies into witnesses for the moral credibility of the United States. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the war for hearts and minds had already been won, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet routine of American camps where coffee, bacon, and bread became the tools of something more lasting than conquest. And as the sun rose each morning, casting light on the camp's flag and the long lines of prisoners heading toward the mess hall, one truth emerged, that strength was not only measured by firepower, but by restraint. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing into silence. The thunder of artillery that had once echoed across the continent was replaced by the quiet footsteps of prisoners boarding ships, not for battle, but for home. Yet before they returned, something extraordinary unfolded within the walls of America's prisoner of war camps. It was not a riot, not an escape, but a revelation. The moment when German soldiers, who had once sworn fealty to Adolf Hitler, began to see the truth about the world they'd been taught to hate. The first shock had always been food, the coffee, the bread, the endless supply of calories. But the deeper transformation came from routine. For years, the German military had enforced discipline through fear. Now in the hands of their American captors, discipline came through order, fairness, and a strange kind of trust. The same men who had been taught to see mercy as weakness began to sense that this calm, structured life without cruelty was strength. In Camp Swift, Texas, the transformation reached its symbolic peak. It was July 1945, and the war in Europe had ended 2 months earlier. Germany lay in ruins, cities burned, the Reich had vanished. But here, under the hot Texas sun, the prisoners were alive, and more than that, they were free from fear for the first time in years. That morning began like any other. The bugle sounded at dawn. The American flag rippled in the breeze. The prisoners lined up for breakfast, eggs, potatoes, coffee, and thick bread still warm from the ovens. Yet there was something different in the air, a sense that the war's end had shifted something invisible. The guards spoke more freely. The prisoners stood less rigidly. A rumor had spread through the camp overnight. A Red Cross officer had arrived with newspapers. Germany had surrendered weeks earlier, but for many prisoners this would be their first glimpse of the truth. The papers, printed in English, carried photographs of Berlin in ruins. Smoldering buildings, collapsed bridges, starving civilians. A headline read simply, "Hitler dead, Germany capitulates." The men stared at the images in silence. Some refused to believe them. Others wept quietly, not for Hitler, but for their families buried beneath those ruins. The illusion was gone. One American officer, Captain Harold S. Claiborne, recorded the moment in his diary. They looked at the pictures like men staring at ghosts. One said in broken English, "So this is what he left us." Another simply sat down and stared into his coffee for half an hour. In that moment, the quiet strength of the camp, the food, the fairness, the restraint became a kind of mirror. The German soldiers who had been fed, Lies about American decadence now saw what moral power truly looked like. Their world had been built on force. This one, astonishingly, was built on discipline guided by conscience. That realization spread beyond the camp. Red Cross inspectors and Army intelligence officers began noting changes in attitude among the POWs. Reports described prisoners who requested English language books, who volunteered for civic lectures, who asked questions about American government and industry. A marked shift in loyalty and perception is evident, one report concluded. Many prisoners express admiration for the United States order, fairness, and prosperity. It was subtle but monumental. The moral architecture of the American camp system had achieved what no leaflet or speech could. It had reshaped the convictions of men who once fought for tyranny. But the transformation wasn't purely ideological. It was also deeply human. In one Texas camp, an American cook named Private Robert Bob Yates became something of a legend among the prisoners. Each morning he prepared the bacon and bread with military precision, ensuring every plate was identical. When a German sergeant asked why he bothered with such care for enemies, Yates reportedly answered, "Because that's what soldiers do for soldiers." The words spread through the camp like folklore. To men conditioned by years of brutality, that small act, or an even portion of breakfast, while it was almost incomprehensible. But it left an impression that no propaganda could erase. Across the United States, similar stories unfolded. At Camp Atterbury in Indiana, POWs volunteered to build new barracks for incoming prisoners. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, German musicians formed an orchestra that played American and German pieces alike, performing under the same flag that had once been their enemy's symbol of defiance. At Camp Bowie, prisoners organized soccer tournaments attended by local American families, who brought their children to watch through the fence. Each of these events, though small, represented a profound shift, the erosion of hatred, replaced by respect. The climax came when repatriation orders began. The war was over, and the German POWs would soon return home. But many of them didn't want to leave. It sounds absurd, almost unthinkable, yet the records prove it. Letters poured into the War Department from POWs requesting to stay in the United States as laborers. Some begged to remain on the farms where they'd worked, offering to sign contracts for years if only they could avoid returning to the devastation of Europe. One letter from a prisoner in Arkansas read, "We have learned more about real freedom in this camp than we ever did in Germany. If possible, we wish to stay here as workers and live among these people who treat us as men." The U.S. government could not grant most of these requests. International law demanded repatriation, but the mere fact that enemy soldiers wanted to remain among their captors was a testament to the quiet triumph of America's conduct. The farewell scenes were unlike anything the world had seen before. In the early months of 1946, trains filled with POWs began departing for East Coast ports. At Camp Swift, the same men who had once stood rigid during roll call now exchanged handshakes and, in some cases, hugs with the guards who had watched over them. American cooks packed them sandwiches for the journey. Some prisoners left behind handmade gifts, carved wooden eagles, small flags, or letters of gratitude. One note found later in a mess hall read, "We came as enemies. We leave as men." At the docks, as the ships prepared to sail, the contrast between the two worlds could not have been sharper. On the American shore, uniformed guards waved, shouting farewells. On the horizon, ships bearing the mark of the Red Cross waited to return the men to a shattered homeland. For many prisoners, the true weight of their experience struck only then. They were going home to a nation destroyed, to a regime disgraced, to a people uncertain of their future, but with memories of bacon, coffee, and fairness that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. In post-war Germany, the stories of these camps spread quietly but powerfully. They were told in kitchens, at church gatherings, and among veteran circles. Men who had been broken by war recounted how the Americans had treated them with discipline, order, and humanity. For many, this became the seed of reconciliation, the foundation of the post-war friendship that would later define West Germany's alliance with the United States. Historians later recognized the American POW program as one of the most successful and humane in modern history. The War Department's strict adherence to Geneva principles wasn't merely a matter of law, it was a deliberate moral strategy. The coffee served at dawn, the bread baked fresh each morning, the decency shown to defeated men. All of it was designed, consciously or not, to demonstrate that democracy could defeat fascism not only on the battlefield, but in spirit, and it worked. Decades later, during interviews for oral history projects, former German POWs described their captivity in America not with bitterness but with gratitude. One former Luftwaffe pilot held at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, recalled, "The first time I realized Germany would lose was not when we ran out of ammunition. It was when I saw how the Americans treated their prisoners. That's when I understood what kind of nation we were fighting." Those words, quiet yet piercing, captured the essence of the turning point. The Allies' victory had been secured with weapons, but their legacy was cemented with restraint. In that restrained power lay the ultimate transformation. The German soldiers who once viewed mercy as weakness now recognized it as strength, the kind of strength that rebuilds rather than destroys. And as their ships pulled away from the American coast, the morning sun glinting on the waves, many of them carried a memory that would never fade. The sound of a bugle at dawn, the scent of coffee in the air, and the simple truth that sometimes the most powerful victories are not won with bullets, but with breakfast. When the German prisoners finally began their long voyage home in 1946, the war they had known was gone. Their uniforms were tattered, their loyalty shaken, and their homeland, once filled with banners and speeches, now lay buried beneath rubble and ash. But deep inside them was a quiet, unfamiliar strength, the memory of how their captors had treated them. For most, repatriation began in silence. The journey across the Atlantic felt longer than the one that had brought them there years before. The ocean mist clung to their faces as they leaned against the ship's railings, staring into the horizon. The United States disappeared behind them, but its impression remained, in the smell of bread, in the sound of laughter from American cooks, in the sight of guards who had never raised their rifles in anger. When they arrived in Europe, the contrast was almost unbearable. Germany was a landscape of ghosts. Cities they had known were gone: Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Munich, all flattened by bombing. Rail lines twisted like broken ribs, fields were flooded and lifeless. Millions were displaced. Families wandered roads in search of missing sons. For the returning POWs, it was like stepping into another world, one where the Reich that had once promised eternity had left only ruin. The Allied authorities processed them through reception centers. Many were questioned about their experiences in American camps, part of the post-war intelligence effort to understand the mindset of the defeated. Again and again, the same story surfaced, not of brutality or resentment, but of disbelief. "We expected cruelty," one former soldier told an interrogator. "Instead, we found fairness." The report circulated quietly through the U.S. War Department. Senior officers understood the long-term impact of what had happened. The POW program had done more than contain enemies. It had reshaped perceptions of America itself. Military historians later called it psychological victory by conduct. The German government of the late 1940s, struggling to rebuild under Allied occupation, began to realize the value of that moral legacy. Former POWs who had spent years in American camps became some of the most stable and democratic voices in post-war society. They had lived firsthand the difference between tyranny and order, between fear and principle. One such man, Dieter W., a former Wehrmacht corporal captured in Tunisia, became a schoolteacher in post-war Bavaria. In interviews years later, he said, "When I taught my students about democracy, I didn't need books. I remembered how the Americans treated us. That was my lesson." Stories like his multiplied. In town halls, newspapers, and small cafes, the myth of American brutality, once propagated by Goebbels, collapsed under the weight of living testimony. Men who had once believed that surrender meant torture now spoke openly of discipline, fairness, and even kindness. They told stories of American guards who shared cigarettes, of medics who treated wounded Germans with care, of Christmas meals in captivity that felt more humane than their last years of freedom in the Reich. In some villages, when word spread that former POWs had returned from America, people gathered to hear their accounts. They spoke of rows of clean barracks, of work details in sunny fields, of the strange sound of jazz on the camp radio, of guards who followed rules instead of rage. For war-weary Germans living in hunger and fear, those stories sounded like echoes of another civilization, one where decency had survived the war. Meanwhile, in the United States, the camps emptied quietly. Barbed wire fences came down. The watchtowers were dismantled. The barracks were sold to farmers or turned into housing for returning GIs. In many towns, only a small concrete foundation or a faded sign marked where the enemy had once lived. Yet for those who had worked in the camps, the guards, the cooks, the local civilians, the experience had left its own kind of mark. Farmers who had hired POW labor often spoke with respect about the men. Some wrote letters to them after the war, sending photos of harvests or new barns the Germans had helped build. A few even received replies, careful, grateful notes from across the Atlantic. One farmer in Iowa later recalled, "They worked hard, never complained. When they left, we missed them. It felt like the end of a strange friendship." That sentiment, simple but honest, reflected something larger, the beginning of reconciliation through memory. The American government documented the success with cautious pride. Official reports highlighted the efficiency of the POW system, the low escape rate, the minimal disciplinary issues. But what those reports could never fully capture was the moral gravity of what had occurred. The United States had demonstrated on a scale never before attempted that even in total war, humanity could survive without compromise. It was not perfect. There were isolated cases of abuse, of resentment among guards, of friction with civilians, yet compared to the horrors that had unfolded in German and Japanese prison camps, the American system stood as a beacon of restraint. Even Britain, struggling under wartime scarcity, could not maintain the same level of abundance and order. As the Cold War dawned, the lessons of the POW program found new purpose. The same humane discipline that had governed the camps became a model for psychological operations and reconstruction efforts in post-war Europe. The idea was simple but profound. Win loyalty not by fear, but by respect. In this sense, the story of bacon, coffee, and bread at dawn became more than an anecdote. It became a symbol of American soft power before the term even existed. It was proof that moral authority, when applied consistently, could achieve what brute strength never could. The legacy lived on in unexpected ways. In the 1950s, when West Germany rearmed under NATO, many of its senior officers were former POWs from American camps. They brought with them memories of U.S. military discipline and admiration for its balance of order and humanity. When the Bundeswehr was founded in 1955, its code of conduct, emphasizing citizen in uniform and respect for law, echoed those very lessons learned behind American barbed wire. One of the architects of that doctrine, General Wolfgraf von Baudissin, had himself been a prisoner in Australia under American supervision. He later wrote that captivity under fair treatment taught us what true soldierly honor meant. His ideas became the moral framework of the new German army, one that pledged never, again, to follow blind obedience into destruction. The ripple effect extended beyond military philosophy. Former POWs played roles in rebuilding Germany's civic institutions, its schools, and its local governments. They became a quiet generation of witnesses who carried with them an image of America, not as conqueror but as teacher. For many Americans, this legacy remained invisible. By the late 1940s, the POW story was already fading from public consciousness, overshadowed by the atomic age and the new global tensions of East versus West. Yet across the Atlantic, in the memories of men who had once been enemies, it endured. One of them, a former Luftwaffe sergeant named Heinrich K., visited the United States decades later as a tourist. Standing in a diner in Texas, he asked for coffee. When the waitress poured it and smiled, he reportedly said softly, "It smells the same." For him, that aroma carried the entire memory of a moral awakening, a scent that reminded him of the mornings when he first realized that decency could exist, even in war. The humanitarian foundations laid by that experience shaped more than just hearts. They helped rebuild bridges between nations that had once sought each other's destruction. By the time President Eisenhower visited Bonn in 1959, he was greeted not only as a statesman, but as a symbol of the nation that had shown restraint when revenge would have been easy. And so, the true aftermath of the POW camps was not measured in statistics or logistics, but in conscience. The men who had eaten American bread under guard returned home to rebuild their country, and many did so guided by the quiet lessons learned each morning at dawn. They carried with them the understanding that victory, achieved without cruelty, could last, while victory born of hate would always collapse. In the ruins of their homeland, they planted that lesson like a seed, one that would eventually grow into one of the most stable democracies in modern history. It was never about the meals alone. It was about what those meals represented: discipline without oppression, strength without arrogance, and morality without weakness. And long after the last camp was dismantled, the memory remained: the sound of a bugle in the Texas morning, the smell of bacon, the warmth of bread, and the realization that, even in the darkest chapter of human history, there were moments when humanity refused to surrender. History often remembers the war through its destruction, through the burned cities, the fallen soldiers, the cries of the wounded. But there is another story, quieter and more enduring. It is the story of how a victorious nation chose discipline over vengeance, structure over chaos, and conscience over hatred. The story of how the United States treated its German prisoners stands as one of the most overlooked moral triumphs of the Second World War. In the stillness of those camps, between dawn roll calls and the clatter of metal trays, something profound happened. Men who had marched under swastikas, who had once believed the world beyond Germany was cruel and corrupt, discovered compassion in the unlikeliest place: their enemy's kitchen. Each cup of coffee poured, each loaf of bread baked, each fair command given chipped away at years of indoctrination. It was not ideology that defeated them in those moments, but decency. The real power of America in that era was not only its tanks or planes, but its moral discipline, its ability to uphold the rules even when it didn't have to. That quiet power echoed long after the war ended, shaping how former enemies viewed democracy, honor, and justice. In a world shattered by brutality, those simple breakfasts became symbols of civilization itself. They reminded both captor and captive that humanity could survive even amid barbed wire. Decades later, as the last of those prisoners grew old, they often spoke not of fear, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the small kindnesses that had made them question everything they once believed. Many died still remembering the scent of coffee on American soil, a scent that had come to mean hope, fairness, and peace. War reveals the worst in humanity, but sometimes it also reveals the best. And in those quiet mornings at dawn, when the sun rose over the camps and men lined up for food not out of fear but out of trust, the world caught a glimpse of that better side, a moment when strength chose mercy and mercy became victory.